Spilling red wine on a man's suit in Montreal's most exclusive private dining room usually ended careers. Doing it to Olivier Beauchamp, the man who quietly owned half the port of Montreal and the loyalty of every longshoreman, customs officer, and city councillor who mattered, usually ended other things entirely. It ended nothing for Penny Kowalczyk, mostly because Olivier Beauchamp, for the first time in 11 years of running his empire from the shadows, laughed. Panic had a specific smell inside Maison Beauchamp. It smelled like aged cognac, nervous sweat, and the faint metallic undertone of a room full of men who carried concealed weapons under their tailored jackets. The private club occupied the top 2 floors of a restored limestone building on Rue Saint-Paul in Old Montreal, all exposed brick and cathedral ceilings, and the kind of silence that expensive real estate buys. Beauchamp Consolidated was the legitimate face: shipping logistics, port management, commercial real estate. What it actually managed was the organized movement of every significant contraband shipment entering Canada through the St. Lawrence Seaway, and the financial architecture that made it all disappear into respectable ledger columns. Olivier Beauchamp was 41 years old, built like a man who had spent his 20s doing things he no longer needed to discuss, and ran his organization with a precision that made the Montreal police force look like amateurs at their own jobs. He wore charcoal Zegna, kept a Rolex Submariner on his left wrist, and spoke in a quiet, unhurried, French-accented English that made grown men immediately reconsider whatever they'd been about to say. 3 event coordinators had quit in the past 6 weeks. One had a panic attack during a dinner service when Beauchamp raised a single eyebrow at a floral arrangement he hadn't approved. Another simply stopped returning calls after overhearing a conversation she was never meant to hear. The third had resigned via text message at 2 in the morning with no explanation, which everyone in the building understood completely. They needed a replacement by Friday. The staffing agency sent Penny Kowalczyk. Penny had exactly $12 in her checking account when she answered the agency's call on a gray Tuesday morning in November. At 26, she was accustomed to the particular mathematics of being broke in an expensive city, which bills to pay this week, which to defer, whether the bus or walking, made more sense given the weather and the state of her boots. She was a big woman, soft and round in the way that a lifetime of cheap carbohydrates and second-hand winter coats produced, with dark Polish-Ukrainian coloring, thick black hair that never quite behaved, and a laugh that carried 3 rooms over. She had worked banquet hall service since she was 19, knew how to move through a crowded dining room without spilling anything, and possessed an organizational instinct so finely tuned that she had once restructured the entire supply chain of a catering company in Laval on a Tuesday afternoon because it bothered her that the delivery schedule made no sense. The agency did not tell her about Beauchamp Consolidated. They told her the daily rate was extraordinary. She should have asked more questions. Her first evening was a private dinner for 14. She arrived at 6, received a 12-page event brief from a terrified assistant named Kevin, who held the clipboard like a life preserver, changed into the required black uniform in a bathroom the size of her entire apartment, and set about organizing the service flow with the calm efficiency of someone who had fed 400 people at a Ukrainian cultural banquet with 2 staff and a broken warming oven. She was navigating the narrow corridor between the kitchen and the private dining room at 7:43, balancing a decanter of 1998 Pomerol in each hand, when the kitchen door swung outward faster than physics should have allowed, catching her left elbow with significant force. The decanters tilted. Penny corrected. The correction overcorrected. One decanter achieved a brief and graceful arc before baptizing the left shoulder of a charcoal Zegna jacket in approximately $800 worth of aged Bordeaux. The corridor went absolutely still. The man wearing the jacket turned slowly. He was tall, dark-haired, with a jaw that looked like it had been assembled with structural intent, and eyes the precise grey of Lake Ontario in October. He looked at his shoulder. He looked at the decanter. He looked at Penny, who was frozen in the particular posture of someone calculating exactly how bad the next 30 seconds were going to be. "I am so sorry," Penny said in a voice that was entirely steady, because she had learned in 19 years of service that apologizing while visibly panicking only makes things worse. "I'll cover the cleaning, or the replacement. I'll figure out the replacement." She paused. "That's a Zegna, isn't it? Okay, I'll figure something out. Payment plan. I'm very organized." Olivier Beauchamp looked at her for a long moment. The two men flanking him, large, quiet men with the particular stillness of people professionally trained to be still, had gone rigid, and then Beauchamp made a sound. It was brief and low and completely involuntary, and it was unmistakably a laugh. He walked into the dining room. His men stared at Penny. Penny carefully set down both decanters, retrieved a fresh one from the cabinet, and went back to work. By Thursday, she had reorganized the event calendar for the next 3 months, identified a $40,000 discrepancy in the catering supplier invoices, and accidentally walked into a room containing 4 men who went completely silent when she entered, at which point she excused herself, backed out, and decided she had seen nothing, which was the correct instinct and probably saved her life. The betting among the staff, the legitimate staff, the kitchen workers and cleaners and administrative assistants, who moved quietly through Maison Beauchamp, pretending not to notice things, was substantial. Nobody lasted. There was a rotation, a rhythm to it. New coordinator appeared, new coordinator encountered the reality of what Beauchamp Consolidated actually was, new coordinator departed. Penny was already past the average tenure. On Friday afternoon, she knocked on the door of Beauchamp's private office. He was at his desk, a massive piece of reclaimed timber that had probably come off a ship. Reviewing documents that she now understood were not entirely what they appeared to be. He didn't look up. "The DuPont event next week," Penny said, stepping inside. "Your current floral supplier is overcharging you by about 30% relative to comparable vendors I found. Also, I restructured the service flow for the Thursday dinner because the original schedule had a 17-minute gap in the second course that was going to make the whole evening feel slow. And the invoice from Leclerc Provisions for October has been submitted 3 times with different line items. I flagged it." She placed a folder on his desk. "I left the supplier contact information and a draft letter. I didn't send anything without your approval because I don't know what your relationship with Leclerc is, and I didn't want to assume." Beauchamp set down his pen. He looked at the folder. He looked at her. "You found the Leclerc discrepancy," he said. It was not quite a question. "The invoice numbers didn't match the delivery logs. Numbers do that. They don't lie to protect anyone's feelings." She hesitated. "Is Leclerc a problem? I can be very diplomatic in writing, or very not diplomatic, if that's more useful." Beauchamp leaned back in his chair and studied her with the focused attention he usually reserved for people who had done something requiring his personal response. In his world, which was populated entirely by people who wanted things from him and people who were afraid of him, Penny Kowalczyk was a category he didn't have a name for yet. She was standing in his office in a slightly too small uniform, with her hair escaping its pins, holding herself with the completely unaffected confidence of someone who had simply done her job well and wanted him to know about it. "I will handle Leclerc," he said. "Okay," she picked up her folder. "Do you want the DuPont proposal with or without the alternate floral options?" "I made both versions." He looked at her for another moment. "Both." She nodded and left. He found himself watching the door after she'd closed it, which was not something he typically did. The shift happened gradually enough that no one could identify exactly when it started. Beauchamp began leaving the heating on in the event coordination office, The room faced north and was genuinely cold. And he'd simply noticed her wearing her coat indoors and found it distracting. He routed certain supplier calls through her desk because her written follow-ups were more effective than his lawyers. He fired a kitchen manager in early December after the man made a comment about Penny's weight within her earshot, a comment so precisely calculated to wound that it had clearly taken the man some effort to assemble. The kitchen manager was gone before Penny came back from her lunch break. She noticed these things and carefully did not examine them too closely, because Penny Kowalczyk had spent 26 years learning that hope was a budget item she couldn't always afford. She also noticed other things. The men who arrived for private dinners with their faces carefully neutral and their jacket lines slightly wrong. The phone calls Beauchamp took in the small office off the main corridor, the ones where his voice dropped an entire register. The armored panel she caught a glimpse of behind his bookcase one afternoon when the cleaning staff left a door ajar. The way everyone in the building, from the sommelier to the men who'd stood by the stairwells, operated with the particular precision of people who understood that mistakes had consequences well beyond a bad performance review. She knew what it was. She wasn't naive. She was a girl from Verdun whose father had worked the docks for 30 years and knew exactly what certain logistics arrangements meant. She should have left. She stayed. The pay was clearing her mother's medical debt. The health coverage was the best she'd ever had. And there was the other thing, the thing she refused to look at directly, which was that when Olivier Beauchamp walked through his own building, he looked at her like she was the only person in it who was actually making sense. It was her own fault, really, for going out for poutine alone. It was a Wednesday in January, -22 with the wind chill, and Beauchamp was locked in a meeting with men from a rival organization out of Toronto, the Varro family, who had been attempting to establish a presence in Montreal's port operations for the better part of 2 years, and were running out of patience about it. The tension in the building was the kind that made the regular staff find reasons to leave early. Penny, who had been at her desk since 7 in the morning and had genuinely just wanted a bowl of poutine from the place on Rue de la Commune that did the proper dark gravy, told Kevin she'd be back in 40 minutes and walked out into the January cold. She didn't make it to Rue de la Commune. The van was black, windowless, and idling at the mouth of the alley she cut through. The same alley she'd cut through every day for 2 months. 2 men in dark coats were out of it before she registered what was happening. She was a big woman, and she made herself difficult, throwing her weight backward, grabbing the doorframe of the building beside her, hard enough to tear a nail, kicking with real intent. One of the men swore in Italian. The other caught her arm with both hands. "She's strong," Varro said. "Grab her." "Not wrestler, I am standing right here," Penny said loudly, which was a strange thing to say under the circumstances, but she said it anyway. And then they got her into the van and the cold went away. She woke up in a room that smelled like cedar chips and old motor oil, which she would later learn was a storage facility in Laval. Her wrists were zip-tied to a metal chair, and across from her, sitting on a folding table with the satisfied expression of a man who thought he'd done something clever, was someone she identified as Varro, mid-50s, silver-haired, the kind of expensive that looks cheap, which is a very specific aesthetic. "Messieurs Kowalczyk." He spread his hands. "I apologize for the unorthodox invitation." "I want it noted," Penny said in a voice that she was furious to discover was shaking, "that I was on my way to get poutine. This is a significant inconvenience." Varro smiled the smile of a man who finds things amusing when he controls them. "Beauchamp has become sentimental about his new coordinator. I find that interesting. I thought we might have a conversation about what exactly a woman like you is doing in that building." "Coordinating events," Penny said. "I do the florals, the supplier invoices, the service scheduling. I also found a billing discrepancy that your friend Leclerc was running, if that's relevant." Varro's smile flickered, just slightly. He pulled out a phone. He dialed. It rang once. Varro. Beauchamp's voice through the speaker was absolutely level, which was somehow worse than if it had been anything else. "Where is she?" "She's comfortable. I want to discuss the Seaway contract. I think we can come to an arrangement that—" "If you have touched her," Beauchamp said, still in that same level voice, "you will not need to concern yourself with contracts." "Beauchamp, I'm fine," Penny said loudly toward the phone, because she wasn't fine, but she wanted him to know she was conscious and functional. "He hasn't hurt me. He's attempting to use me as leverage, which is honestly a fairly transparent strategy. I'm a staffing agency placement. I do not have access to." Varro ended the call. "That," Penny said, "was probably not going to help you." Back on Rue St. Paul, Olivier Beauchamp was already moving. He did not waste time on emotion. He had a location within 6 minutes. Beauchamp Consolidated's relationship with Montreal's security infrastructure was one of the organization's most carefully maintained assets. He strapped a vest under his suit jacket with the efficiency of a man who had done it before and would not discuss it at dinner parties. His second, a man named Gilles, who looked like a retired hockey enforcer because he was, had 12 men staged and ready in under 10 minutes. The convoy left from the underground garage, 4 vehicles, organized and quiet. In the storage facility in Laval, Penny was doing what Penny did when she was frightened, which was think very fast and organize what she had available to her. What she had: a metal chair, zip ties with a small amount of give, a concrete floor, a wall of shelving units approximately 2 meters to her left, 1 guard. Varro had gone to make calls, apparently confident that the chair and ties were sufficient. A young man with a phone who kept glancing at it, and approximately 300 pounds of momentum. She had never in her life thought of her weight as a resource, a logistical complication, a reason that certain doors opened more slowly. She had spent years apologizing for the space she took up. She threw herself sideways with everything she had. The chair hit the concrete floor with a crack like a gunshot. The impact rattled through her entire body, and she bit her lip hard enough to taste copper. But the left armrest splintered on impact, which was what she'd calculated. She wrenched her left wrist free, which hurt considerably, and used her free hand to push herself up to her knees in the wreckage of the chair. The guard was across the room in 3 steps. "Hey, stop." Penny was already moving, awkward and fast, pulling the zip tie off her right wrist with her teeth while she scrambled behind the nearest shelving unit. The guard grabbed the shelf to stabilize it. Penny pulled the entire unit forward. It weighed, she estimated later, somewhere between 80 and 100 kilograms. She used her back and both arms, and what she could only describe as the particular fury of a woman who had been kidnapped on her way to get poutine in -22-degree weather. The shelving unit came down across the guard's shoulders and knees, and he went with it, pinned. "I'm sorry," Penny said automatically. "I'm really. That was more than I intended. Are you okay?" The guard was not okay, but he was alive, which was better than some of the alternatives. The exterior wall had a single window painted shut. Penny used a fallen shelf bracket to break the latch, shoved the window open, and spent several extremely undignified moments getting her hips through the frame. She would later tell no one about this part, before dropping into an icy loading dock and landing in a snowbank. She was standing barefoot in January in Laval, her uniform ruined and her left wrist already swelling purple, when the convoy came around the corner. The vehicle stopped. The passenger door of the lead vehicle opened. Olivier Beauchamp stepped out. He stood in the headlights and looked at her, standing in a snowbank, one shoe lost somewhere in a storage facility, holding a shelf bracket, her hair completely destroyed, and something moved across his face that she had never seen there before. It was not the controlled assessment he usually wore. It was raw and urgent, and she didn't quite know what to do with it. He crossed the distance between them quickly, his shoes crunching through the ice, and when he reached her, he put his hands on either side of her face and looked at her with an intensity that felt like a question he didn't have words for yet. "You're bleeding," he said. "I bit my lip. I'm fine. The guard is under a shelving unit. He needs to be looked at." She heard her own voice shaking and was annoyed about it. "I couldn't get the window open any other way. I tried the bracket, but—" Penny. Her name in his mouth, in that quiet, French-inflected voice, stopped her completely. He said it the way you say something you've been thinking about for longer than you meant to. "Stop explaining. I knocked over a shelving unit on a man. I feel like that requires—" He kissed her. It was not tentative. It was the kind of kiss that happens when someone has been holding something back for long enough that when the moment comes, there's nothing careful about it. His hands were still holding her face, and she was cold and shaking, and her wrist was throbbing, and she kissed him back with the accumulated weight of 2 months of pretending she wasn't thinking about him, which, she was discovering, was considerable. When he finally pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers, and she could feel him breathing. Behind them, at a respectful distance, she was dimly aware of Gilles and 11 other men very carefully looking at anything else. "You were already out," Beauchamp said quietly. "I wasn't going to wait," she said. "I had a reasonable plan. You knocked over a shelving unit." It worked. A beat. Something in his face shifted, the way ice shifts in March. Not breaking yet, but changed. "I had 30 men on their way. I know. But I wasn't going to sit in a chair and wait for someone else to solve it." She looked at him, close enough to see the specific gray of his eyes. "I was never going to do that." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he very carefully took the shelf bracket from her hand, passed it to Gilles without looking at him, shrugged off his jacket, and put it around her shoulders. "Can you walk? I'm missing a shoe." He picked her up, not with effort, not with drama, just picked her up and carried her to the vehicle, which she tried to object to, and failed because her wrist was genuinely very painful, and the warmth of being carried was difficult to argue with. In the weeks that followed, things at Maison Beauchamp rearranged themselves permanently. Varro's arrangement with the port was dismantled with the quiet thoroughness that Beauchamp Consolidated applied to problems that had been allowed to continue too long. Kevin the assistant relaxed incrementally. The heating in the coordination office remained on, and Penny Kowalczyk remained. She still mixed up the wine service occasionally. She once sent an email meant for the floral supplier to 17 members of Beauchamp's inner circle, which was a very interesting 3 minutes until she caught it. She tripped over the threshold of the private dining room, in front of a table of people who collectively commanded the East Coast port infrastructure of an entire country. Nobody said a word about it. Not anymore, because the woman at the front of Maison Beauchamp, the one who managed the calendars, caught the billing fraud, restructured the supply chain, and had dismantled a shelving unit with her bare hands in a storage facility in Laval, was not someone you made careless comments about. She was the one person in Olivier Beauchamp's carefully constructed empire who had walked in the front door as exactly herself, and stayed exactly that way. She didn't reshape herself to fit the world she'd landed in. The world rearranged itself around her, which is how it should have always worked, and how, in her particular case, it finally did.